Vampires, of one form or another, have haunted our folklore for hundreds of years, and they've changed a lot over that time. But one of the most consistent associations made with vampires is religion. Religion was the other side of the coin of this monster. Good Christians gathering in the morning light to drink the blood of their living Lord, while the vampire huddled in shadows, draining dry the blood of living man. Vampires came to be seen as the manifestation of everything unholy and unclean, and thus symbols such as the crucifix were seen as vampire deterrents. All the way from Dracula up into modern-day stories, vampires and religion have been side by side. But just as our ideas of the vampire have morphed radically over time, going from a literal walking corpse to a gentleman in silk, so humanity's relationship with religion has always been in flux. And in that narrow space between holiness and horror, we can learn a lot about the role of monstrosity in our society, the relationship between story and truth, and the ever-shifting, kaleidoscopic face of evil. And fortunately, I will not be covering this topic alone today, because I am very excited to introduce you to a special guest.
So my name is Sister Allison Regina Goliath. I am a sister in the Catholic Church, the member of the Daughters of St. Paul. I am also an author of books for teens and kids. And my most recent book that has come out is a vampire novel called The Curse He Chose. It's going to be part of a trilogy of vampire books. And so that's why I'm here, why I'm talking about vampires. My background is in theology and also in writing. So I have had a lot of experience over the years in reading vampire books and in thinking about them and in talking about them with lots of people and now in writing them. So I'm very excited to be here today.
And how do you know me?
I know Jess because she is my littlest sister. I mean, there's a little sister and then there's a littler sister, and Jess is the littler sister. So yeah, we've been together her whole life. Not my whole life, but her whole life.
I want to give a huge thank you to my dear sister, Sister Allison, for joining us this week. Now, do be warned that we are going to be spoiling quite a few pieces of media that we talk about in this video. As we start talking about a new story, if we are going to spoil it, you will see a timestamp pop up here, and you can go ahead and skip to that timestamp if you want to avoid spoilers, and those timestamps will also be available in the description if you need them there. I also just want to mention that we are specifically going to be focusing on Christianity in this video, specifically Western Christianity and Catholicism, just because not every video can be about everything, and as you can tell from the runtime, this is long enough already. But there is a whole range of interactions between religion and vampires from around the world that I will probably cover in later videos, but I also highly recommend that you look into other videos and other resources about that if you're curious. And one more thing before we really sink our teeth into this video, I want to tell you about this video's sponsor, ZocDoc. Once upon a time, I was the queen of procrastination, and this was especially bad when it came to doctor's appointments. I hate making phone calls, my schedule's a mess, and I did not have very much fun trying to wrestle with my insurance to find a provider that'll work with me. But with this video's sponsor, ZocDoc, I was able to find a doctor, make an appointment, and finally get that checked off my to-do list. ZocDoc is a free website where you can search and compare high-quality in-network doctors, choose the right one for your needs, and click to instantly book an appointment. From primary care to dentistry, eye care to skincare, and nearly everything in between. ZocDoc makes it easy to book in-network appointments with more than 100,000 healthcare providers. With ZocDoc, you can filter for doctors by insurance, location, and specialties, and see reviews by real verified patients, so that you can choose the best, most convenient care for you. Once you've found the doctor that you need, you can see their actual appointment openings, choose the time that works best for you, and instantly book your visit with just a few clicks. Plus, ZocDoc helps you get appointments fast, typically within just 24 to 72 hours of booking, and you can even score score same-day appointments. And there is no need to call doctor's offices and wait on hold. ZocDoc allows you to do everything online. So stop waiting and guessing like I have, and start getting yourself the care that you need. Go to ZocDoc.com/JessOfTheShire to find and instantly book a top-rated doctor today. That's ZocDoc.com/JessOfTheShire to find and instantly book a top-rated doctor today. Thank you so much to ZocDoc for sponsoring this video, and let's get back to it. The exact origin of the vampire myth is remarkably nebulous. In fact, we're not even really sure where the term came from and what it originally meant, but we do believe that vampirism arose out of a fear of death, particularly a fear of dead bodies. Vampires were thought to be corpses that fled their graves at night, feeding on the blood of the living. This idea was reinforced by them opening the coffins of supposed vampires and finding them not nearly as gray and withered as they thought they would be. In fact, these people seemed to be filled with blood, their skin taut, bloated, and red. There was blood sometimes everywhere, filling the coffins, spilling out of the people's mouths. Of course, nowadays we recognize that these are just signs of normal decomposition, which, although alarming, are not a sign of vampirism, but back then, these signs were attributed to the supernatural, and it was believed that this was caused by incorrect burial of the bodies, as well as other factors. And although this was definitely a very superstitious idea, this fear of bodies and a desire to dispose of them properly, it was a healthy fear. During times of trouble, especially plague, body disposal was often the first thing to be neglected, and lackluster burial practices meant that bodies were just laying around, or they surfaced from shallow graves. They were there to putrefy and attract vermin, inevitably decreasing the health of the community. The exact origins and cause aside, by the end of the medieval period, the idea that a corpse could somehow be revived and walk around and cause damage to its community was relatively widespread, especially across Central and Western Europe. And when Christianity spread and became the dominant religion on the continent, it also adopted vampires into its theology. This was one of the things that allowed Christianity to propagate so rapidly and so thoroughly. They were willing to take older traditions into the fold, to reclothe them in the garb of Christianity, meaning that if you wanted to convert to Christianity, you could convert without abandoning your entire way of life and all of your older folk practices. This informed the way that celebrations such as Christmas and Easter were observed, as they would use the dates and traditions from pagan festivals to shape these Christian holidays. And it also meant making vampires part of Christian theology.
In the past, a lot of times the folkloric traditions were very closely tied to the religious aspects of people's lives because people didn't put religion in boxes necessarily the same way that we sometimes do today. Like, it's like, this is a part of your life and it kind of bleeds over into everything. And so when you're dealing with an undead spirit that's trying to eat you, you're going to think about, okay, what do I do when I meet a demonic spirit? I go get my priest, or I pray. So it's very natural for people to turn to these religious solutions for what they perceive to be a religious problem. Because when you look at like what vampires were thought to be, they're like revenant spirits kind of animating dead corpses a lot of time, which is really gross. Like we don't always go into the grossness factor in modern day vampire stories as much, but like the idea was often that it was either someone's spirit returning from the dead, often the spirit of someone who had been evil or heretical in some way in their life, returning to the dead to wreak havoc on the living, or it could also be a demonic spirit taking over a dead body and then doing stuff. So they were often seen as agents of Satan or, minions of evil. And so when you have something evil, you want to turn to the good force in your life, which was often faith and religion.
Now let's get our timeline straight here by establishing that vampires were not a medieval phenomena. Some so-called vampire burials, in which bodies were decapitated, disfigured, or interred with weapons laying across the throat of the corpse, came from the medieval period or earlier, but we can't actually say for certain if those practices were ever connected to the recognizable vampire legend. The vampire, as we would recognize it, actually came to be in the mid-1400s. And before that point, and all through the medieval period, the church was one of the voices actually actively discouraging the belief in and hunting of things like witches, werewolves, and vampires. But as witch hunts and inquisitions became more and more prominent through the 1400s and into the 1700s, the church changed its position. In fact, it has been proposed that one of the reasons the vampire myth has survived up until today is because of the way that the church popularized and legitimized it. The vampire truly is an inversion of so many Christian ideals. Blood was a sensational symbol within Christianity, as every week believers gathered to drink the blood of their Savior. This blood granted them eternal life with God, just as drinking the blood of mortals gained the vampire's infernal immortality. The vampire went from supernatural monster to Christian demon, and thus the church also positioned herself as the solution to this problem. After all, the best way to prevent your good buddy Archibald from becoming a blood-sucking demon after he died was to make sure that he got a proper burial, and this came to mean a proper Christian burial. It was then in Archibald's best interest to make sure that he was in good standing with the church. He should attend Mass. He should have a relationship of some kind with the priest. He should be a good Christian. Archibald must also avoid things like excommunication or suicide, things that would keep him from being able to be buried on consecrated ground. Overall, it was really just best for everyone if they made sure not to piss their local priest off. And for the local priest, it was a pretty sweet gig. As long as people feared vampires, then they had to respect you. You were necessary, and people wanted to be on your good side. And now I'm not trying to frame the Christian church in this period as some kind of a manipulative mastermind. As always, it's important to remember that these institutions are made up of individuals, and there were good individuals and bad individuals. But you absolutely can't deny that monsters such as the vampire were a very useful tool for keeping your community in check. In the late medieval and early Renaissance period, vampires also functioned very well as a scapegoat. Just like werewolves or witches, a vampire could be blamed for almost anything. You've got pestilence, you've got plague, well, it could be a vampire doing that. You've got people acting unusually, committing violent crimes, or engaging in acts of cannibalism. It's probably a vampire. Really, any behavior outside of the norm is easier explained as something supernatural, rather than trying to come up with an explanation as to why humans or the randomness of nature would do that. Once you had determined that a vampire was the reason, all you had to do was figure out who the vampire was, usually someone undesirable or someone outside of the norm of society. You opened up their coffin and you stuck some stakes in it, or put a weapon over their neck, or decapitated them and put their head between their knees. Did it necessarily fix the problem you were facing? Probably not, but at least you felt like you had some kind of agency. By the late 15th century, the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, was published, which lined out the process for prosecuting heretics, witches, and yes, vampires. So it was that vampires were right in the fray with witches, werewolves, and the other so-called magical supernatural beings being persecuted in the name of God. Belief in vampires would actually outlast witches and werewolves, peaking in the 18th century, but by then, theologians and religious authorities were beginning to get a bit wary.
So especially in the 1700s, when those questions started coming up more often, people were sending physicians to actually go look into this and have a serious point of view about it. Theologians were writing about it, kind of arguing with each other of like, okay, so then what happens if someone comes back from the dead, but it's not the resurrection from the dead that God wanted for us? Like, what does that mean? What do we do about it? And so it was kind of being treated as a serious question in theological circles, even though there was skepticism, a little bit of like, well, is this actually real? We don't really know. But if it was real, it would work like this maybe? Or, like kind of coming up with those ideas of how would this fit into our theological understanding of the world if it was real. So that's kind of like the Christian take on vampires, like at that time period.
We had some people, such as the Benedictine abbot Calmet, writing entire chapters about vampires, saying that if they are real, which he wasn't necessarily sure, they would most certainly be agents of the devil. But this was all going down in the mid-1700s, when there were also a lot of efforts happening to disentangle ourselves from our superstitious past. Thinkers like Voltaire were actively protesting against the notion that vampires were real, taking particular issue in the church's involvement in legitimizing the idea. In 1764, Voltaire wrote, "What? Is it in our 18th century that vampires exist?" Calmet became their historian and treated vampires as he treated the Old and New Testaments, by relating faithfully all that has been said before him. The true vampires are the monks, who eat at the expense of both kings and people. It's fascinating to me that as early as the mid-1700s, when some people still fully believed in the vampire as a real phenomenon, we also had folks like Voltaire, proving what a rich and powerful metaphor the vampire could be. The vampire had emerged in a very specifically religious context, in which the vampire was the antithesis to everything that Christianity represented, and here was Voltaire flipping that on its head, and identifying the vampiric characteristics that may have existed within the church. But there were some religious leaders who were coming out trying to quash this superstition.
So there actually was a document that a pope wrote in the 1700s. It was, I believe, Benedict the 14th, where he was talking about the phenomenon of incorruptibility in saints. And so there is this strange miracle that sometimes happens with saints, especially in the Catholic Church, but in other Christian traditions, sometimes too in the Orthodox Church, where sometimes God will preserve a saint's body from becoming corrupt after death. And like even centuries later, they will not have rotted. Nothing bad will have happened to them. Like their body is like preserved the way it was when they died. And that is not really able to be explained. I mean, in most cases, not able to be explained by any natural means. And so in this document, he was actually distinguishing between, okay, the incorruptible saints, like when we see that happening, that's a good thing. That's a divine intervention from God. That's a sign of holiness. And that has nothing to do with all of these crazy stories that we're hearing about vampires and vampire bodies and bodies being, dug up and still looking kind of lifelike and their hair is growing and stuff. Like that is different. And he attributes that to either that there's natural scientific causes that we just don't understand that are like at work there, or people's like fear and superstition. So he is directly referencing vampires and basically saying, he's implying that they are not real. I mean, it's not like an official dogma of the church. This is a very like obscure document that didn't carry like the same doctrinal weight as a lot of other important documents in the church. But it is there, and he takes a pretty skeptical attitude of like, yeah, that's different. This is real, that's something else.
Sister Allison is referring to 1752's Treatise on the Canonization of Saints, in which Pope Benedict XIV implies that vampires are probably not real, but if they were real, they would be agents of the devil. But as real belief in vampires started to burn out, especially in Western Europe, the vampire tradition thrived in the Eastern Orthodox tradition.
Especially in the Christian Orthodox churches, vampires were a pretty big thing that they were thinking about, just in the context that most of the vampire traditions that we see arising in Europe were in areas where the Orthodox Church was very present. So like in Greece and Romania and other parts of Southeastern and Eastern Central Europe. And so they did kind of, in a similar way of the Catholic Church, like have this attitude towards vampires that, yeah, they're probably bad, like they're outside of God's plan for the church. And there's not like one cohesive teaching from the Orthodox Church about vampires, but there's this very interesting, it's a manual that was for Greek Orthodox priests that I believe came out in 1867, where it actually talks about what do you do if somebody burned a vampire? Like, can they receive communion? Can they not receive communion? Like, how does a priest handle that? That is very much like taking it seriously. You know, that's not saying like, oh, they could exist, they could not. It's like, okay, if this happens, do this thing.
This manual that Sister Allison was talking about proclaims, those who burned the vampires and were soaked in their smoke should not receive communion for at least 6 years. Vampires were the submissive instruments of the devil, who appeared at night, wandering here and there, often harming, destroying, and prophesying the future. In this way, those who are many days, and even many years dead, return among the living, as one who is young with flesh and bones. Mind you, this was put out in 1867, just 30 years before the publication of Dracula. Up until the very end of the 19th century, vampires were thought of by some people as real, very real threats to people and to their spiritual life. And this religious overtone to the vampire story, this cosmic conflict between good and evil, would never really leave the visage of the vampire. For example, most of the traditional methods for repelling or purging a vampire are of religious origins, such as holy water. I'll allow the expert to explain.
Yeah, so holy water, I mean, in the Christian tradition, is water that is blessed with a special blessing by a member of the clergy who has the power to give that blessing, like a priest or a deacon. And it is basically, it's a sacramental, so it's not like on the same level as like receiving the Eucharist or getting baptized or something like that, but it's a devotion that we have that is imbued with grace. Like we believe that God really has blessed that water and that it has the power to remind us of God's blessing and also have his blessing be with us. And so there is something like, according to what I and my Catholic faith believe, there is something actually different about the water, not in like a literal physical sense, like that the water is somehow not water anymore, but in the spiritual sense that it is blessed. It has that blessing and power to confer the blessing when you bless yourself with the sign of the cross with it. And so I think that comes up a lot in vampire stories. It's especially like when we talked about a little bit earlier, like the magical object. Oh, maybe we didn't talk about it earlier in this version of the cut.
We did not, but as a sacramental intended to remind Christians of God's blessing, holy water is anathema to the vampire. It is a symbol of grace and a symbol of cleanliness, the purifying waters of baptism, and this is very sharply contrasted to the unclean pollution of the vampire spirit. In some stories, holy water may simply be abhorrent or distasteful to the vampire. In other stories, the results are, well, rather more dramatic. As always, the vampire myth has never been static, and there are a lot of different legendary ways to get rid of them, and some of them are not religiously associated, such as garlic. We don't really think there's any religious grounding behind that, but most of them do have some kind of religious justification and reasoning. Take, for example, sunlight.
A lot of the older stories don't actually have vampires having any problem at all with the sun. I mean, they do a lot of their work at night, but that's because if people during the day see somebody corpse-like eating people, they'll stop them, and they don't want to be stopped. So I feel like in a lot of the older stories, it was more of a practical thing, or maybe like a symbolic thing of like bad things happen at night or the darkness. So I think that you can look at it, like from a faith perspective, you could look at like the darkness versus light makes a very clear, like simple analogy of like goodness, light, life, things are alive and awake and moving versus the darkness, the night, bad things happen there, you know, kind of idea. Like on a very basic level, you could look at it from that respect. There has traditionally been like a symbolism associated with Christ and the sun. Like, I believe it's in the book of Malachi that the Messiah is referred to as the Son of Righteousness, sun being spelled S-U-N, not S-O-N. And I know throughout the Middle Ages, like the sun was often associated with like God's very powerful, like divine power. Not that people believed that the sun was God, but just that it serves as a great symbol for like the brightness of his light and his glory, more than many other things in the created world.
So it is that nearly every vampire story from the past 200 years has the creatures operating at night. Whether that is, as Sister Allie suggested, simply convenience, everything is a little bit scarier when it happens at night, or if there is more theological grounding behind it, the idea of sunlight hurting, destroying, or being distasteful to the vampire is one of the most consistent things passed from vampire story to vampire story. In my opinion, this phenomenon can be chalked up to something that Lestat says in the interview with the Vampire Show. The sun gives life to everything but us. Humans thrive on sunlight. It's how we grow our food. It's how we warm our skin. It's how we light our homes. Before we figured out how to harness fire, sunlight was the thing that allowed us to see each other's faces, to know each other, and to form community. But the vampire must give all of that up. He has chosen to not feed on the fruit of the earth, but on humankind itself, and the sun is no longer a giver of life. Rather, it is what will deliver them into death. I do think of this as an evolution of the idea of the vampire as the exact inversion of Christian faith. That which gives life and light to the good people takes it away from those who have given themselves into darkness. But no symbol has had more of an effect on the vampire legend than the crucifix.
So a crucifix is the cross, like the cross that Jesus died on, with an image of the body of Christ on the cross. And that is something that has been hugely important in the Christian tradition for a long time as a sign of devotion, of like, not that we think a crucifix is literally Jesus, but as a reminder of Jesus dying to save us, and like that act of salvation that happened on the cross where Jesus defeated death. And so I think that it's often used in vampire stories, especially because you're talking about not only a demonic or undead creature like in the traditional vampire stories, but also because it is the sign of God's defeat over death. Like, Jesus died on the cross, but death could not hold him. He rose from the dead. And so because of that, the crucifix is a really powerful symbol of God's divine power and of true life, like resurrected life, which really goes counter to everything that a vampire is doing with coming back unnaturally from the dead and killing people to sustain themselves. So I think that that is why like the crucifix is such a powerful symbol in vampire traditions and vampire stories, as well as it just having kind of a role throughout tradition of also being something that demons really don't like, because they don't like the reminder of God and his power, and the what it means that like if you have a crucifix as a faithful Catholic or Christian, that you believe in this, your loyalty is with God, you're counting on him to protect you, and so the understanding that is like the demon can't or isn't going to attack you because you have God backing you up.
Nearly every vampire story contends with the crucifix at one point or another. Either it acts as a potent weapon or a bait and switch, but it is always there. Even the improvised crucifix has made a mark on the mythos.
With a lot of symbols, the important thing is not what the actual like literal object is, it's what it stands for. And so whether your crucifix is made out of like hand-carved wood or metal or like whatever, like that's not the important part. The important part is what it means and the power that it's invoking from the Lord. And so the improvised like cross idea is that like, well, the cross itself is still that power, it has that weight. If you are turning to the cross in your time of need, or using that against a vampire, or a vampire is going to be sensitive to that because it still has that meaning, even if it's not, you didn't get it from a pretty gift shop or whatever. It's not the specific material that it's made out of, it's the power behind it. And that is something that like just the image of the cross itself does appear in some older legends. I know in the legends of Saint Christopher, who was a very early martyr in the church, Roman martyr. I think it was the Roman Empire that killed him, but sorry, I didn't fact check this ahead of time. It is a lot of the stories surrounding him are mainly legendary. Like we don't have a lot of historical evidence of a specific guy named Christopher doing these things, but the stories about him are quite old, and one of them is that he was an extremely powerful, like strong guy, and he was looking for someone to serve who was the most powerful. And so, he tried serving the Roman emperor, didn't really cut it for him because he realized that the Roman emperor is still scared of demons and things. And so he's like, oh, great, Satan's the strongest. Let me go serve him. This is my version of the story, by the way. If you go read the original legends, they're a little bit more polished. But so he goes and serves Satan, and he's like, great, he's the most powerful. And then he realizes one day he sees Satan like flinching at a cross and like is like, wait, is that more powerful? And so he like tested it out. He like he does this with his fingers, and even that is enough to like drive Satan away, and Satan can't hold him under that like bondage any longer. And so because of that, he's like, okay, well, clearly this Jesus guy that everybody is talking about is the most powerful if even Satan is afraid of him. And so he goes off and spends the rest of his life serving God. So I think you see the power in there of like, even just doing this with your fingers is enough to make a demon flee because of that incredible infinite power that is contained in the cross when God saved humanity by literally dying and coming back to life. So that's one of those like main mysteries of salvation, that is like, even evil spirits do not mess with that. So when faced with a vampire, it seems like a pretty good bet that like, if you can bring that up somehow, it's not going to hurt your case.
Signs and symbols are a very important aspect of Christianity, and because vampires survived, in part as a relic of Christianity, this religious thought has always loomed large over the myth. This was only cemented by the overt inclusion of religion in the great-grandfather of all vampire novels, Bram Stoker's Dracula. Dracula was written and published at a very volatile time. By the 1890s, most of the world was teetering over the precipice of modernity. The Industrial Revolution had stripped us of our pastoral past, germ theory had upturned the foundations of traditional medicine, and academics like Charles Darwin were shaking the religious foundation that had shaped previous centuries. As the Victorian period was coming to a close, secularism was more popular than it had ever been in the past, and there were quite a few people who were abandoning religion altogether, deciding that science was the century's new lifeblood. And from the heart of all of this turmoil came Dracula, a novel that was, for its time, surprisingly overtly religious. And Dracula didn't just go to establish many of the tenets of modern Gothic horror, it also exists as a novel of its time, addressing many of the anxieties of the day. The secular versus faith, supernatural versus science, the role that religion would have in the new century. Dracula tells the tale of Jonathan Harker, a young lawyer from London who is sent up into the Carpathian Mountains to deal with a particularly tricky client. He writes of his journey. I read that every known superstition in the world is gathered into the horseshoe of the Carpathians, as if it were the center of some sort of imaginative whirlpool. If so, my stay may be very interesting. We can see from the very start the artful way that Stoker is building up our perception of the supernatural. Jonathan is coming from civilized, modern London into this whirlpool of imagination, literally traveling through space and time into a new world, where he will have to come face to face with many of the ancient things that modern society has tried to pretend never existed. But as he travels towards Transylvania, he's also experiencing a profound change in the religious climate. Jonathan is, like most of the main characters of this story, a practicing Protestant, meaning that he doesn't go in for all of the signs and symbols traditionally associated with Catholicism. But as he's traveling deeper and deeper into the Carpathians, he's suddenly seeing peasants praying on the side of the road, using crucifixes to repel evil. Stoker lines out this kind of more ritualistic and fervored worship as a relic of the old world, something that Jonathan must contend with as he moves away from modernity and into the past. And this old world can also contain things like the Count Dracula. Dracula is a gentlemanly, strange, repulsive creature that at first seems merely out of time, but soon proves himself to be out of everything that Jonathan knows. Jonathan watches in increasing horror as the foreign and strange gives way to the truly monstrous, the Count's vampiric nature revealed. But the true horror of this tale is not in this interloper stumbling into the world of the supernatural, but rather the ways in which the supernatural, ancient, and strange managed to infiltrate their way into modernized society. Dracula sails to London, where his very first prey is Lucy, the beautiful friend of Jonathan's fiancée, Mina. As Lucy rapidly fades, her soul gnawed away by Dracula's dark influence, modern medicine is left utterly unable to help her. They must call in the esoteric Professor Abraham Van Helsing, who arms himself and his companions with knowledge, and this troop of good old red-blooded men must defeat this strange danger. But in order to rid themselves of the Count, they're going to have to get a good deal better at accepting the unknown.
The stakes, sorry, the story stakes, the narrative stakes, not the literal wooden stakes, are greatly dramatized by having this metaphysical view that vampires are evil, like demonic evil, and your soul is at stake here. So it's not just that you might die, it's that you might go to hell because of what's happening. And that makes the story a lot more stressful and high tension than it otherwise would. And so you see that pretty much all of the human characters have this fear of like, what is gonna happen in the afterlife if you get turned into a vampire, or if we fail to address this evil that's kind of being a plague on the people that we love. And so for them, it's very closely tied to their faith tradition, their understanding of the way the world is through that religious lens.
As far as we're aware, Bram Stoker was a Protestant, but he was also raised in Ireland, and Ireland has a long tradition of being Catholic. And I think you can kind of see the uncomfortable interplay in this novel between the anti-ritualistic Protestant mode of thought and the highly ritualistic Catholic environment. While most of the characters are Protestants, and they are upstanding and righteous in their own way, it isn't until they call in the Catholic Abraham Van Helsing with all of his strange Catholic practices that they're able to defeat the monster. And this push and pull was a very hot-button issue at the time. In the late 1800s, especially within the Anglican Church, there was a lot of debate between those who wanted to lean more into the ritualistic side of things and those who were staunchly anti-ritualistic. Those in favor argued that signs and symbols helped to bring the liturgy to life, that as Jesus became incarnate, so the teachings of God could come alive through objects, and that these things helped everyone, literate or not, to invest themselves in the mystery of God. Those against ritualism said that the use of these things was another form of idolatry, that it denigrated the craft of preaching, and that these ritual objects were distracting from true worship. As Noel Bowles puts it, for non-ritualistics, it is the believer who brings sanctity to the communion. For the ritualist, the blessing, and the subsequent holy essence of the blessed object. Although he never wrote much about his personal beliefs, I believe that, at least from Dracula, we can extrapolate the idea that Bram Stoker was more on the ritualist side of things. Or at the very least, he was very interested in examining how these ritualistic objects might challenge or enhance faith. On the trip to Transylvania, a Romani peasant gives Jonathan a crucifix as a way of protecting him against the darkness that he's headed into, and at first he is very skeptical of it. But as the danger of the Count presses closer and closer in, he realizes that the crucifix may be having some kind of an effect against him. Baffled, Jonathan muses, "It is odd that a thing which I have been taught to regard with disfavor and as idolatrous should in a time of loneliness and trouble be of help. Is it that there is something in the essence of the thing itself? or that it is a medium, a tangible help in conveying memories of sympathy and comfort. Sometime, if it may be, I must examine this matter and try to make up my mind about it. Throughout the story, we see these Protestant characters being challenged by Catholic sacramentals. They're left wondering why this cross would have some kind of effect on this creature of darkness. Is it just because of the happy and pious memories that it evokes, or is there some kind of power inherently imbued in this symbol? Later on, holy water is used to corral in and control Dracula's minions. Van Helsing brings out the Eucharistic host, and it has a devastating impact against Dracula. All of these things work. And this is both a marvel and a terrible challenge of faith to these Protestant characters. They've been told that these symbols are, at worst, idolatry, and at best a distraction from true Christian worship. So why are they working? I think that this is all part of a larger challenge by the book to try and encourage you to accept and live in the messy gray areas. This wasn't important just to examine the differences between religion, but also to examine the way that science and religion would interact in the coming century. Science had blown the presuppositions of the past out of the water, and it seemed that people thought that they had to make two different choices. They could abandon the old ways entirely and consign themselves to the new religion of science, or they could cover their ears and close their eyes and pretend that nothing had changed, that the world was exactly as it was before. But some people hypothesized that the supernatural and religion may have a place in science, and that perhaps science was, in its own way, supernatural. Van Helsing explains, "You are a clever man, friend John. You reason well, and your wit is bold. But you are too prejudiced. You do not let your eyes see, nor your ears hear, and that which is outside your daily life is not of account to you. Do you not think that there are things which you cannot understand, and yet which are? That some people see things that others cannot? Ah, it is the fault of our science that it wants to explain all, and if it explains not, then it says there is nothing to explain. But yet we see around us every day the growth of new beliefs, which think themselves new, and which are yet but the old, which pretend to be young." So it is that the workings of faith, which nowadays seem inscrutable or supernatural, may one day be able to be explained as science. Verifiable, measurable, fully logical. Van Helsing, and thus the book at large, seem to be in favor of moving towards a scientification of religion, and perhaps a making of science to be a bit more religious. And this is also done through the inverse of religion, Dracula. Dracula, although supernatural, has certain rules that he must follow. He needs blood, he must sleep on the earth of his homeland, he can change shape into particular creatures. It is suggested that he is of demonic origins, that he functions in a similar way to a demon, pulling people away from the light and closer towards hell, but he also must follow many rules, which, in another light, seem kind of scientific. It makes sense, then, that the way to repel him, then, would be through science and belief together. Their destruction of Dracula is not a matter of sitting and praying, it is a matter of learning, studying, and then using the tool of knowledge to combat the knowledge that Dracula has. By making the supernatural and religion a science, Stoker forges a new place for it in the new world. But the problem is that once you turn religion into science, you are kind of taking away the faith part. The handling of religious items and symbols in this book is not always, theologically sound from the Catholic perspective, which Van Helsing is supposedly operating from. And nowhere is this clearer than in his treatment of the Eucharist, which in the book notably is never called the Eucharist, simply the host or even the wafer.
So the Eucharist, according to the Catholic understanding, is the body and blood of Christ. Like bread and wine is actually turned into the body and blood of Christ. And so they use that as a very powerful weapon or deterrent against the vampires in the story because they're evil. And something that is evil does not want to come into direct contact, literally, with God. And so that's something that they use when, oh, this is a spoiler for Dracula, sorry, but when Lucy gets turned into a vampire and they're trying to stop her, they use the sacred host to kind of control her movements, where she goes. They use it later on in the story too, in a very important way, to kind of neutralize the grave dirt from Dracula's various coffins that he has around that he's using to, keep himself going and maintain his power. And so in that story, you really see how these sacramentals, like the Eucharist or the crucifix, have a very powerful and real effect on the vampires. But I think that it's interesting that in the story itself, most of the characters don't really understand why this works. I mean, they know it's like associated with God, but they don't like start praying a lot because of that. They don't think, okay, maybe like if we go hide in a church or whatever, this is going to fix the problem. Or it's not necessarily super integrated into the story. And even I think that it's probably the shortcomings a little bit of the author's perspective, because he was not Catholic, but he's trying really hard to write a good Catholic character, and he tried really hard. He did a pretty good job. But there's certain things about the way, even in the story, that Van Helsing is talking about the sacred host, that a real Catholic probably would not treat it that way. It kind of ends up being sort of a magical object. Like, this is the spiritual opposite of what the vampire is, therefore we can just stick it in places and use it to help us control these vampires or defeat them. But they're not treating it the way that like a practicing Catholic would reverence the Eucharist or use that.
In Dracula, the monster is defeated by knowledge. Very much in the sensibilities of the late Victorian era, the way that these people improve themselves is by studying, by learning, by quantifying these things, and thus they are able to out-intellectualize the intellectualized supernatural. Despite the stakes of the story involving these people's soul being at risk, it is not through spiritual growth that they defeat Dracula. Rather, they just learn his ways better than him. It makes for a very neat, very scientific categorization and boxing away of this supernatural fear. But this also means that the tools used to defeat him, the Eucharist, the crucifix, his mental connection to Mina, also experience some kind of a reduction in power. As Elizabeth Sanders explains, God, as another supernatural being, shares Dracula's loss of mystery and unknowability. One could say that the scientism that Dracula and the other vampires have contracted seems highly contagious. It cannot affect one supernatural being or concept without affecting others. God, like the vampire, is now bound by rules and principles to which humanity is privy, and thus the divine becomes another body of knowledge that the late Victorian intellectual can not only conquer, but utilize. Despite the characters in Dracula all being worshipping Christians, despite them constantly acknowledging the fact that their souls are at risk, I wouldn't say that anyone in this story has a truly personal relationship or connection to God. In fact, God is kind of an absent and maybe even powerless character. Take, for example, the instance when Van Helsing takes one of the Eucharistic hosts and presses it to Mina's forehead, as an effort to extract the influence of Dracula from her. She is instantly burned by the touch of this holy item, forming a mark on her forehead, and she cries out, "Unclean, unclean! Even the Almighty shuns my polluted flesh!" Van Helsing confirms that this is a mark bestowed by God, that this is God's way of showing that he knows what has been in this story. They all come to the conclusion that this mark will remain on Mina's forehead until the end of time, until Judgment Day. But I ask you, what has Mina done to deserve this mark from God? What has she done to deserve this scarlet letter that forever marks her out as a victim of terribly spiritually unclean pollution? Mina has, throughout the novel, been excessively godly and pure. She really is the perfect woman of this era. She's clever, she's kind, and she's deeply obedient to the men in her life and to God. This corruption has come upon her due to no fault of her own. She was essentially assaulted by this force of evil, So why is it that she will be permanently marked out for this sin that she didn't even intentionally commit? Why is it that this mark will remain on her, unable to be prayed or repented away until the end of time? This mark doesn't seem like the symbol of a very fair or loving God to me. In the world of Dracula, God is systematic. Sin is something that can be foisted upon a completely holy and unwilling participant. God has no control over how sin is marked out. He has no ability to forgive or to heal. And to me, that doesn't really sound like the God that most Christians worship. In order to try to jam traditional religion into the mold of the modern era, Stoker has had to shave off so many of its edges that it's become unrecognizable. The signs and symbols are there, they are theoretically powerful, but a true relationship with God is relegated only to the poor peasants, those outside of modernity who don't know any better. Dracula is not a theological diatribe, and it was never intended to be. It is a product of its time, translating the fears and anxieties of its era in the complex, multifaceted mirror of fantasy, such that even today we're still trying to puzzle out exactly what it all means. Much in the tradition of the Gothic that would come to be, it provokes, it begs questions, it prods at anxieties, and it refuses to try and give a neat or satisfying answer. Religion in Dracula is a strange, misformed, and nebulous, but incredibly lasting thing.
A lot of people shaped their ideals about what a vampire is and what a vampire story should include from Dracula, that a lot of them feel like we have to include this in here somewhere. Like there has to be a crucifix, or we have to use some holy water, because it was so important in Dracula. But in the same way, I don't know, if you could say that Dracula set the standard for a lot of our expectations about vampires, it also set a pretty low bar in some ways for the treatment of religious objects as far as being some kind of weapon against vampires. And like I said, Dracula is not the worst way you could handle that. Like in many ways, the characters are taking the faith topics very seriously. They are trying to live good lives and bring their understanding of the faith to what's going on with the vampire, like where it comes from, what the demonic origin is, and how they want to then counter that. So it's not the worst way that it could be handled, but I think as you see later stories form, people take the surface level elements of some of those religious things that happen in Dracula and even lose even more of the depth there, because he was writing in a time where a lot of people did have a pretty solid understanding of Christianity. A lot of his readers were practicing some kind of faith, did have a belief in God and in heaven and in hell that played in a role in their lives in some way. I have a feeling that there were some things that he didn't say or didn't feel like he needed to say because he was writing in that specific kind of cultural and societal context. Whereas now I think when things get a surface level treatment, or it's just kind of like, oh yeah, we'll nod to that, but we're not actually going to explain this, and we don't even really know where vampires came from. Like, are they associated with Satan? That's kind of messy. We're not going to talk about that. Instead of, assuming readers know that or are going to work that out, it just kind of becomes like a, I don't want to get into all that. So sometimes it's there, like in a surface level way, and sometimes it's kind of overlooked completely.
For better and for worse, Dracula has become the mold of the modern vampire story, combining the elegant, high society killers of Sheridan Le Fanu and John Polidori with this undead, unholy creation from the Christian tradition, clashing together into this soupy mass that has loomed large over every vampire story from the 20th and 21st centuries. For example, belief plays a particularly integral role in Stephen King's iconic vampire story, Salem's Lot, especially in the character of Father Callahan. Callahan is a Catholic priest, one who has long since found himself disillusioned with his faith. He became a priest under the misunderstood idea that he would literally be joining God's army. He had zeal, he wanted to fight demons head to head, to die for his faith. But once he became a priest, he realized that true faith leadership wasn't in exorcising demons, but was more so in dealing with the steady, dead, onrushing engine of the church, bearing down all petty sins on its endless shuttle to heaven. It was the ritualistic acknowledgement of evil by a church now more concerned with social evils. It was a mindless, moronic evil from which there was no mercy or reprieve. This is not the kind of evil that can be exorcised. This is the small, petty, casual cruelty that's just part of human nature. It is evil, as he calls it, with a small e, rather than a large one. Father Callahan explains. He wanted this struggle to be pure, unhindered by the politics that rode the back of every social issue like a deformed Siamese twin. He had wanted all this since he had wanted to be a priest, and that call had come to him at the age of 14, when he had been inflamed by the story of Saint Stephen, the first Christian martyr, who had been stoned to death and who had seen Christ at the moment of his death. Heaven was a dim attraction compared to that of fighting, and perhaps perishing, in the service of the Lord. And it would seem that in the story, Father Callahan gets everything he wants. A vampire named Barlow comes to town, and he is asked to head the group of people trying to defeat him. And at first this electrifies him. He finally has a type of evil that he can literally fight. But soon enough, his years of waning zeal catch up to him. He faces off against the vampire Barlow and thrusts a crucifix in his direction, and Barlow is repelled by its holy power. But then Barlow challenges the priest to put the crucifix down. If his faith is sure, symbols are only a crutch, a child's teddy bear, a rifle clutched by a man who knows very well he couldn't win a fist fight. True faith would mean dropping this simple symbol and facing the devil barehanded with the power of God behind you. But Father Callahan's relationship with God has long since deteriorated. He refuses to let go and let God, and the divine power of the crucifix flickers out. Barlow casts the now disempowered crucifix aside easily, and as a punishment, he forces Father Callahan to drink his blood, cursing him to immortality as a sinful vampire. Callahan tries to return to the church, but just touching the door to this sacred ground burns him. He turns away and leaves town, knowing that this is not a punishment from God. It's not a punishment brought down upon him by the divine. This is a punishment that he brought on himself. He let his faith slip away, and now he must face the consequences. He was tested and failed, not because of momentary weakness, but because a lifetime of wrongful choices, because of his willful misunderstanding of what the church was and of who God was. The crucifix lost its power not because of any inability of God, but because of Callahan's inability to back up these symbols with true belief, with confidence. Although Stephen King establishes that vampires predate the actual Christian faith, the power of God is readily available for those who are willing to actually believe in him. Barlow is, in the end, defeated by Ben and Mark, using religious sacramentals and symbols, but truly believing in them. Their childlike wonder and faith is contrasted to Callahan's utter pessimism. Leonard Mostaza writes, Ben and Mark are fully prepared to believe in both the benevolent power of God and the mindless malevolence of the vampire, and that is why, King suggests, they are aided by the former and respected by the latter. That is why, in the last analysis, they survive when all others lose to the vampire. Belief, that is true, soul-deep belief, is the groundwork in Salem's lot, both belief in good and belief in evil. But some stories leaned out of the supernatural and into the scientific while still integrating religion, such as Richard Matheson's I Am Legend. This is a kind of weird hybrid between a vampire story and a zombie apocalypse, in which a virus spreads that turns everybody except for one man into a slavering, bloodthirsty monster. and this man is left trying to figure out how to get by, and possibly how to save humanity as the last man standing. As the man learns more about this contagion, as he scientifically figures out how it works, garlic and sunlight can kill bacteria, wooden stakes have a very particular effect on the illness of this vampiric disease, there's one part of it that he can't quite square. Why are so many vampires, not all, but so many, afraid of crucifixes? Eventually he realizes that it's a psychological symptom, and that explains why only some of the vampires are repelled by crucifixes, because not all of them are Christian. Here, Matheson places the impetus of the efficacy of these symbols not on the person bearing these symbols and their belief in that symbol, but on the monster itself, and whether or not the monster itself thinks that this symbol will have power against them. This is such a fascinating reversal, and it goes to show just how much of monstrousness is not always literal or scientific, even in stories, but it is often in psychology and in perception. Folks like Stephen King and Richard Matheson built up a really strong tradition in mid to late 20th century vampire stories of being able to address religion, even if the vampire story is not explicitly about religion. Then again, there are still plenty of vampire stories that completely attempt to ignore religion and not to address it at all, but it kind of unavoidably starts popping up in those stories. And in the world of 21st century vampires, you really can't ignore Twilight. Twilight presents an interesting conundrum, because from the outset, it is not an overtly religious story. I don't believe that Stephenie Meyer ever addresses whether or not the vampires are affected by religious symbolism, but Stephenie Meyer, the author, is herself Mormon, and is Mormon to the degree where she said that the Book of Mormon is the book that has had the most impact on her life, so she's fairly faithful. And because of the prominence of her faith in her life, I think it is inevitable that there was some thematic drift of that belief system into her books. Now, in the same way that I constantly talk about Tolkien's Catholic worldview impacting The Lord of the Rings, but the fact that it is still a good secular book, I'm not going to try and say that Stephenie Meyer's faith ruins Twilight in any serious way. But it definitely is, let's say, a present factor. For example, one of the main moral conflicts of this story is between two different types of vampires. The vampires who truly give in to their vampiric nature, into their basest desires, killing and eating people, and then there are so-called vegetarian vampires that don't eat people, and instead ignore their impulses and eat animals in the pursuit of goodness. And this aligns very neatly with the Mormon concept of natural man. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints website defines natural man as a person who chooses to be influenced by the passions, desires, appetites, and senses of the flesh, rather than by the promptings of the Holy Spirit. Such a person can comprehend physical things, but not spiritual things. All people are carnal or mortal because of the fall of Adam and Eve. Each person must be born again through the atonement of Jesus Christ to cease being a natural man. Vegetarian vampires such as the Cullens are like those people who have sought the atonement of Jesus Christ and have been born again from their state of being natural man, and they are praised for this choice. The Book of Mormon also preaches that Native Americans are actually Israelites who came over to America from the Middle East a couple thousand years ago. This comes through in Twilight with a tribe of Native American werewolves who, rather than having Native American names, have suspiciously biblical names, like Jacob, Sam, Paul, Ephraim, Joshua, and Rebecca. In Twilight, there's also an emphasis placed on the importance of permanence in romantic relationships. Mormon marriage includes a ceremony which they call sealing, in which they place emphasis on the fact that this husband and wife are now bound together for all of eternity, in both life and death and life everlasting. Edward and Bella are likewise in it for the long haul, to the point where Bella gets turned into a vampire after they get married so that they can literally spend eternity together. The third book ends with an acknowledgement that Bella's engagement ring will stay on her finger conceivably for the rest of eternity, and the final book ends with them promising to work on things with each other forever and forever and forever. There is so much emotional weight and emphasis placed on the fact that now that they're together, they will truly never be parted. But something that is interesting to note is that in Mormonism, a woman can only ever get sealed to one man, but a man can be sealed to multiple women. For example, if his wife dies, he can be resealed to another woman, whereas a woman, if her husband died, she could not be resealed to another man. And this kind of power imbalance, I do think, is reflected in Edward and Bella's relationship. Although Edward does remain a virgin until his marriage with Bella, he has lived multiple lifetimes longer than she has. He has had relationships, even if not particularly romantic, with far more people than Bella ever could have hoped to in her one mortal lifetime. It's not like they ever mention the term sealing or that Edward gets married to multiple women, but I do think the general structure and the concepts around what a romantic relationship looks like in perpetuity are visible in Edward and Bella's relationship. I also think that Meyer's Mormon beliefs come through in her emphasis put on family. Family is very important within Mormonism, as it is in so many Christian faiths, but especially in Mormonism, just as a couple is sealed to each other for all of eternity, so their children are sealed with them, to be a family unit together forever. And I think that this is well reflected in the together forever immortal family of the Cullen vampires. The Cullens are seen as the model of the perfect family relationship, especially compared to Bella's broken family. The patriarch Carlisle is a good and fatherly figure. The mother Esme is maternal and responsible, in very sharp contrast to Bella's flighty mother and awkward father. The Cullens aren't referred to as a coven, as would be the traditional designation of a group of vampires. They call themselves a family, and Bella desperately wants to join this family throughout the story. Of course, much has already been said by people way smarter than me about the way that Twilight eroticizes abstinence. It revels in the angst associated with it, and it makes this kind of will they, won't they of Bella and Edward having sex one of the main conflicts of the story. The idea of sexual abstinence before marriage is a tenet of the Mormon faith, and this is translated into the story by the fact that Edward and Bella cannot have sex before she's a vampire or before she's about to be turned into a vampire, because Edward is worried that if he's too close quarters with her, he will bite her and kill her. And despite the fact that I have been critical of Twilight on this channel before, this is one of the least offensive things about it. I don't really care that Mormon ideas have made their way into the story. Again, bit of a hypocrite considering Tolkien and Catholicism. It is a little funny to me that you look at things like the fact that Bella doesn't drink tea or coffee like a good Mormon would, but it's not a detriment to the story. Now, where I might say that I have a bit of a problem with it is the ways in which Twilight romanticizes age gap relationships, and especially obsessive toxic relationships. Bella's very first true love is Edward, and it's very sweet that she ends up with her high school sweetheart, basically. She basically, as soon as she meets him, begins forming her entire sense of self around him. Her friends stop mattering to her, she disregards her family, and anytime Edward leaves her, she spirals into a complete depression. She is entirely codependent on this older, more experienced man for her happiness. And I'm not going to try and say that this is something that Mormonism specifically endorses, but it is the case with a lot of especially fundamentalist Christian religions that the messaging that women are given throughout their lives and their upbringing is that their life doesn't matter until a man is involved, a man who can shape their entire sense of self for them. They're not really taught to recognize red flags in relationships. They're not encouraged to develop any skills or hobbies outside of traditionally feminine homemaking activities, and they are told that it's the right thing to do to try and meet a man who you can hinge your entire identity upon. I do find it fascinating that despite Twilight not overtly containing religious themes, and in fact kind of ignoring religion in the vampire story, religion still makes its way in there. It's in the morals of humans and monsters, shaping their worldviews in countless ways. Now, is Twilight a work of masterpiece vampiric fiction? I would probably say no, but it does go to show just how completely unavoidable religion seems when discussing even the least monstrous of this particular monster. When I think about religion and the vampire, I can't help but think of Terry Pratchett when he was describing the impact that J.R.R. Tolkien has had on the genre of fantasy. He describes, J.R.R. Tolkien has become a sort of mountain, appearing in all subsequent fantasy in the way that Mount Fuji appears so often in Japanese prints. Sometimes it's big and up close. Sometimes it's a shape on the horizon. Sometimes it's not there at all, which means that the artist either has made a deliberate decision against the mountain, which is interesting in itself, or is in fact standing on Mount Fuji. So it is that religion has become an omnipresent force in the vampire narrative. However, there are some stories that do completely ignore its context, possibly to their detriment.
One thing that I recently read that I loved, like I thought it was very well written, very enjoyable, but it didn't have the religious element in there at all, and I think it a little bit suffered for it, was a graphic novel called Hunger's Bite by Taylor Robin. It takes place in the 1920s. The two main characters are teenagers that live on a cruise ship. One of them is the captain's son, the other one is the captain's ward, and as they are leaving the dock, a new manager comes and takes over, and weird stuff starts happening on board. And they meet this other passenger, who, this is a minor spoiler because I'm pretty sure it tells you on the back cover, is a vampire. And he is actually a paranormal investigator who is trying to stop this evil force that is on the ship and preying on the different passengers from killing everybody and getting back to land, basically. So in the story, I think what bothered me about the fact that the religious element wasn't included is that it's very specifically set in our world. Like, they're reading Dracula during the story. It's in the 1920s, and so we know it's in the real world, and they're dealing with this like pretty evil, scary, supernatural force, and the human characters are discovering the existence of vampires and these demonic forces for the first time, and nowhere in there is any question asked like, where do these things come from? Maybe would praying help? Is there a priest on board who could do something about this? Like, to me, it doesn't have to be a huge aspect of the story, but especially when you're setting the story in a historical time period when people had actual like real attitudes about vampires at the time. Like, there were beliefs about, Dracula was already out. Like, be like, oh, well, this worked for Dracula. Would it work for us? Like bringing that into conversation to me just makes it a little bit more realistic for the time period that you're setting it in, even though it was still a very enjoyable story.
But that doesn't mean that every story should just try to shoehorn religion in there wherever they can.
I think another example of a story or a series of books that brings up vampires and does include a faith element, but kind of like in a hodgepodge way, would be Cassandra Clare's Shadowhunters universe. She has her vampires in that story basically are humans who have been infected with a demon disease. And so some things are kind of effective against them, like commonly blessed objects like holy water. There's an instance in the story where the character bites a vampire, which you shouldn't do, in case you were considering that. He bites a vampire and is in danger of becoming a vampire, and the solution to that is to drink a heck-ton of holy water. So he does, and it's fine. But I don't know, to me, like at a certain point, I'm like, okay, do you even understand like why holy water is holy? Do you believe in this at all? Like, it's kind of presented more like just the convenient plot device, like antidote to biting a vampire, which again, you should not do. So she has this tendency though in her world building in general to draw on a lot of mythical or religious creatures and themes, such as angels and demons and other types of mythical things in a mythical way. So I know when Cassandra Clare talks about a demon, she does not mean what I understand a demon to be as a Catholic. Like she's using it in her story in a different way. And so in a similar way, I think she's using vampires kind of like, okay, well, we want to bring in some of the faith traditions or like the classic vampire, like, yeah, if you use a blessed weapon or whatever, it's going to be more effective against a vampire. But she's also taking a lot of creative license there, which is fine. Like, I mean, that's up to her to do, but it gets a little bit messy when she is using real elements from real religions like holy water in her stories, or the characters are going to a church to get their weapons from, the secret hideout of the church. So, it can get a little messy there. So I just said a lot of critical things about a lot of very well-loved vampire stories. But I think a story that handles it really well, the faith elements with vampires, is Scott Westerfeld's Peeps, and he has the other book, The Last Days, where he does vampires. And so basically in this universe, vampires come to be, they're humans who are infected with an actual parasite. So it functions as a disease that makes them cannibalistic and really aggressive, and they get like dementia-like symptoms where they're not acting as themselves. And he explains all of the religious underpinning of vampires, of like being having the weakness of crucifixes and holy ground and things like that, because in this world that he made, one of the symptoms that the parasite gives you is that you have a huge vulnerability and hatred towards something that you loved when you were alive as a human. And so he very neatly explains all of this, that in the olden days when people were really faithful and went to church a lot, and that was something that was really important to them, if they died and they loved their crucifix in real life, or they loved going to church in real life, then as a vampire infected with this parasite, that is going to be the thing that is their weakness and that they loathe and want to stay away from because of how the parasite functions. Whereas in our modern day, where a lot of people are not as faith-filled, or religion doesn't play as big of a role in their life, they're not going to have the same reaction to a crucifix as old vampires did, but their weakness might be Elvis Presley music. And so that's how you got to catch the vampire. You got to play the Elvis Presley music. So to me, that's a extremely creative and satisfying way to explain old vampire traditions, but then also the new things that he's doing in his story, without having to go into a lot of detail. You can think about that and be yeah, okay, that makes sense. Now we can move on with the story he's telling, which is not about faith or religion, but feel at peace that he did talk about it and it makes sense and we're good. And I think too, we didn't talk about vampires in speculative fiction, sci-fi fantasy universes that are not our own, or vampire stories that are really drawing from completely different non-European ideas of vampires too, because then you have a lot more space to explore different story options kind of outside the traditional canon of vampire stories as they have come to take shape in Western Europe in the last 200 years.
But I would argue that in the last 50 years or so, some artists and authors have really taken this story down to its bone and examined some of the most fascinating facets of faith in the vampire myth. And I have 3 particular favorites. And if you've been watching this channel for more than a year or so, I'd say you probably wouldn't be surprised to hear that my first example is Interview with the Vampire. I feel like I should begin by establishing that the lore of Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles is inconsistent at best. In the earlier books, it's kind of implied that God isn't real, or at least is kind of irrelevant, but then later on, characters are having religious revivals, they go down to hell, but they also go to Atlantis, so it's kind of all moot point. But anyway, I will do a video about the Vampire Chronicles lore at some point in the future, but the gist is that whether or not God is real, and he probably is in this universe, he and the traditional morals that he dictates no longer matter to the vampire. I mean, how could they? They must drink blood to survive. Even the very most moral of these vampire characters, they're still a serial killer. And I find the way that they rebuild morality inside this amoral world to be incredibly fascinating. But something that remains consistent for most of the vampires in Anne Rice's world is that because they were once humans growing up in history, most of them have interacted in some way with religion. For example, Louis de Pontdulac was raised in New Orleans, which historically was a very Catholic place. So he is culturally Catholic, and he does believe in his faith, at least early in the books, sort of. Like so many people that were raised Catholic and then later drifted away in their adulthood, he no longer believes or lives the main tenets of the faith, but there are still a lot of things that hang on. Namely, for Louis, his being is entirely suffused with this sense of Catholic guilt. He really can't get through life at all without feeling bad about everything that he does. His shaky faith, this imbalance between what he theoretically believes and what he actually feels, becomes this cycle of self-sabotage, perpetuated across centuries. Before his being turned into a vampire, Louis was, for all intents and purposes, a practicing Catholic, but his brother was always the truly faithful one. Stricken by visions and dreams, drawn to a very radical form of mysticism, he seems like some kind of a medieval saint brought to life. And before this point, Louis was willing to entertain this. He thought it was nice that his brother had such a devoted faith. But when these visions start becoming more and more extreme, he begins to doubt. He can accept God and his works on a distant and theoretical level, but now that this is up close, now that he's considering that his own brother could be some kind of a saint, he finds himself unable to believe it. When it comes down to it, Louis prefers the idea of having faith in something more than truly having faith in it. He and his brother get into a fight, and then his brother falls to his death. And it is this loss and this feeling of responsibility that Louis has for his brother's death, for the betrayal of his faith, that begins him on the downward spiral towards vampirism. Louis remembers his faith enough to know that he is inadequate, that he must fix himself before he enters the kingdom of heaven, but without true confidence in the goodness of God, he has no way of achieving redemption. He craves salvation, but will always view himself as unforgiven, as undeserving. When he meets the unapologetically evil Lestat, Louis flips to the opposite extreme, wondering if ultimate damnation may be an easier path. He makes the choice to become a vampire, giving up on the pursuit of light to fall headfirst into the darkness. At least he might be good at that. Just before his turning, Louis muses, "I saw my life as if I stood apart from it. The vanity, the self-serving, the constant fleeing from one petty annoyance after another, the lip service to God and the Virgin and a host of saints whose names filled my prayer books, none of whom made the slightest difference in a narrow, materialistic, and selfish existence. I saw my real gods, the gods of most men, food, drink, and security in conformity." But, as it turns out, a little bit too late, vampirism is not the answer. He finds no more satisfaction skipping towards hell than he had yearning for heaven. He still cannot find his way in the dark, and he can't get it through his head, the fact that if you can't see, if you have no idea where you are, sometimes the best thing to do is to stride forward. So at the very least, you will not be left stuck in the same spot, circling the same cycle of self-abuse over and over and over again. In the books, Louis finds himself trapped in the middle for all eternity, starving himself of human blood in a vain attempt at righteousness, sabotaging his relationships as self-flagellation. Louis' search for God leaves him utterly helpless, because truly, in his heart of hearts, I don't think he believes that salvation is possible for him. He doesn't think of happiness as something real, as something possible, and so he ruins his own chances at happiness. The self-fulfilling prophecy of all self-fulfilling prophecies. The vampire Armand remarks of Louis, "What did I have to tell this sweet-faced vampire Louis, this all-too-human creation of the stronger and brasher Lestat, except that in the world, Louis would find enough beauty to sustain him, and that, in his soul, he must find the courage to exist, if indeed that was his choice to go on living, without looking to images of God or the devil to give him artificial or short-lived peace." As someone who was raised religious, Louis finds it almost impossible to extract himself from the structure of religion, from the hang-ups associated with it, the remaining guilt, the endless yearning for salvation, even if his true belief has long since fallen away. This is also very similar to the religious angst that plagues the vampire Armand, even if his circumstances and psychology make for a very different outcome. Armand was born in 1480 in what is now Ukraine, and he was an immensely skilled artist even as a child, especially in the drawing of religious icons. He was given by his family to a monastery where from a very young age he had drilled into him the idea that salvation was only achievable through complete subservience to the order and to God. He didn't get the chance to advance his artistic talent. He didn't get the chance to build a future with himself. In fact, eventually he was planning on turning himself into the earth, on burying himself in a cell, starving to death in contemplative prayer. But he rather enjoyed the fact that he didn't have to make that choice for himself. It was this religious subservience, this desire to be guided towards salvation, that would shape his relationships for the rest of his life. After being kidnapped and sold to a brothel, Armand underwent terrible abuse, and he was only saved from this abuse when he was purchased by the vampire Marius, who he at first assumed was Jesus Christ himself. Marius corrected him, telling Armand that he wasn't Jesus, but this would lay the groundwork for their relationship to come. Armand's devotion, his religious devotion, once turned towards God, it now had a new master. Marius renamed him Amadeo, a name which means beloved by God. He groomed him into a romantic relationship, and he took advantage of Armand's devotion to mold him into the perfect thrall. Marius reshaped all of Armand's thinking, teaching him that the excess and beauty of the Renaissance period was the true path to salvation, and Armand, just grateful to be guided by a firm hand, believed all of it. He completely reversed everything that he had thought before. As Marius notes of him, "You have the heart of an innocent. You refuse to accept truth that doesn't correspond with some deep, raging faith in you, which makes you ever the little monk, the acolyte. You would be the fool for God, all right, as you were told a long time ago that a saint should be." Armand is eventually turned into a vampire by Marius, and then we get to see the ways in which these traits that have been so deeply imbued into him, this desire to fawn, to make himself subservient to another, we can see the way that this snowballs and worsens across the centuries. His all-consuming desire to be guided makes him incredibly susceptible to abuse, and even after Marius' abuse has ended, he's taken into another vampiric cult where he's taught a new system of belief, and he finds a new thing to make himself subservient to. Over time, this abuse compounds until Armand becomes an abuser as well, willing to manipulate and lie, folding the truth in on itself just to avoid being alone. Again and again and again and again, Armand finds the ship of his life completely destroyed by the storm, and he will cling onto whatever driftwood he can, rather than just kicking away and trying to swim to the shore himself. Although Armand's true religious belief has long since faded, he once remarked of himself that he had a religious soul. This system of belief and devotion, this mindset, has instilled itself upon him and proven inescapable. But there is one vampire who manages to shake off the remainders of faith and forge a new path forward, and that is, of course, Lestat. Lestat was brought up Christian and even wanted to be a priest for a time, but after he had vampirism forced upon him, he realizes that he can no longer cling to that old system of belief. Rather than wallow in self-pity like Louis or transfer his devotion to a new fallible person like Armand, Lestat decides to make his own system of goodness. He says, "I can live without God. I can even come to live with the idea that there is no life after. But I do not think I could go on if I did not believe in the possibility of goodness. Good and evil, those are concepts man has made, and man is better, really, than the savage garden." Having seen humanity from the outside, Lestat is of the opinion that concepts like morality and goodness, those are human inventions. They're not a universal truth or a universal constant that was the cause for these beliefs being instilled upon humans. But he also believes that we have invented these concepts for a reason, that there is something within the human spirit that requires us to have these concepts, that requires us to try and to believe, lest we be completely lost in the confusion of the savage garden. So it is that Lestat makes his own goodness. If he is going to be a vampire, he's going to be good at being a vampire. If he's to kill and eat people, he's going to be the very best at that. If he is to love and to lose again and again, century after century, to burn bright, burn out, and then fight to rekindle himself, then by God, will he be the best one to ever do it. Anne Rice was never particularly consistent with her faith during her lifetime. She kind of oscillated between the extremes. Sometimes she was an outspoken atheist, other times she claimed to be staunchly Catholic, and her works reflect this. Her characters, too, swing wildly between light and dark, between heaven and hell. Belief, she proposes, is an inexorable part of the human experience, and although even in an immortal lifetime you might not figure it out, the power is in that you keep trying, because that is what humans, even vampiric humans, do. The idea that someone might come upon religion, even as a vampire, the idea that they might feel the vacuum of God in their lives, even if they don't know that that is what that vacuum is also a very important idea in The Curse He Chose, a novel written by my own dear sister, Sister Allison. I will allow her to introduce the premise.
Basically, my story is about a human girl named Elizabeth who runs into this vampire that she doesn't know is a vampire named Christopher. And they are accidentally in a situation where they get a lot of vampires angry all at the same time and are then running for their lives together. And the first place they accidentally hide is a church. And when in that church, Christopher, the vampire, really doesn't want to go because he's like, I'm a vampire, that's gonna kill me. But he finds out that it actually doesn't hurt him at all. And that, of course, instead of him being like, yay, I'm not dead, it freaks him out because he's like, oh no, God is watching me, kind of thing. And so the story kind of follows their relationship as they continue trying not to be killed by vampires, as they're trying to figure out, like, what is going on with him? Like, why is he different? Why are these changes happening? And I don't know, they're both also just trying to learn how to be people and figure out their lives.
I would say that the main thing that makes this story work is the fact that vampires in this world must choose to become vampires. It is the curse he chose. There is no accidental turning. Nobody is being forced into becoming a vampire against their will. This is something they do of their own volition. Christopher, the vampire, explains, "It's a choice, an intentional choice. It's the rejection of everything it means to be human. Life, death, love, transcendence, family, home, heartbreak, an eternal destiny, everything. Nothing human is considered to have any value. Only when you're at that point can you become a vampire." Vampires in this story are not literally undead, as far as I'm aware. Rather, the thing that makes them vampires is the complete rejection of their humanity. This is not the theological complication of Mina being marked out for a sin that she did not desire to commit. This is the very real theological concept of sin pushed to its nth degree by fantasy. These vampires, by utterly denying themselves a relationship with God or with anything of the human world, have placed themselves in hell upon earth. But unlike those deceased souls who have put themselves in hell, the vampires still are on Earth, and that means that maybe, just maybe, they could have a chance at redemption. When Christopher is forced to hide in a church with Elizabeth, and the holy ground doesn't just completely fry him up, it opens up a whole can of worms. Just like Saint Christopher, choosing the devil for his ultimate power, and then realizing that that power may not be absolute, the Christopher of the book must begin to question the totality of Satan's hold on him. With the help of Elizabeth, he begins deconstructing his narrative of self-hatred and beginning to move towards a state where he might be able to ask forgiveness. But that doesn't mean he can let go of the past. His resounding message to Elizabeth, repeated again and again to try and get it through her head, is that he's done terrible things. He has done things that he personally deems unforgivable, and he assumes that God will also consider these things unforgivable. But Elizabeth knows better. She knows that the God she is familiar with, the Catholic Christian God, can and will forgive anyone who will truly repent. The push and pull of this narrative, the action, the angst, the yearning, is all grounded in real Catholic theology. It is the drama of salvation history, reflected through the funhouse mirror of fantasy, to become all the more clear. Of course, compared to something like Dracula, the signs and symbols utilized in this story are also much more theologically sound, which I suppose is what happens when a nun writes a vampire book. The vampires in this story are immortal, but it is made explicitly clear that this is very different to the eternal life granted to Christians by God at the end. Rather than experiencing the fullness of human joy expanded across infinity with God, the vampires of this story seek, as Sister Allison puts it, an infinite amount of the finite. Without heavenly intervention, their meager lives are just a little bit of bread scraped thin across far too much toast. Even their vampiric powers are lent some theological depth. For example, their powers of compulsion work on the grounds that the thing that they are compelling the person to do must already be something that the person is considering, something that they are somewhat willing to do. So sin functions, preying on our worst impulses, but not hypnotizing us into doing something that we would never do. Emphasizing the way that vampiric life is the direct inverse of Christian life, vampires must drink the blood of a living person, blood that is pumping through someone's veins, blood that is keeping them alive, just as Christians gather to drink the blood of their living God. In The Curse He Chose, the Eucharist is not a magical item, as it is in Dracula. It is a life-giving food, one that means that God is living in a person, and even someone like Christopher can sense it. When he feeds from Elizabeth after she has taken communion, after she has become the new tabernacle bearer of Christ, he finds himself more invigorated by her blood than anyone else's. Later on in the story, he's able to give up drinking blood entirely because he is sustained by being in the presence of the Holy Eucharist. In this world, the spiritual is made entirely incarnate. These spiritual challenges are made very real, and so God's forgiveness plays a very active role in the story.
So one thing that kind of bothers me about YA portrayals of vampires, in many cases, is that they take all the scary parts out of vampires. Like, they're not really monsters anymore, they're sparkly vegetarians who have really hard skin. And I didn't want to write vampires like that. Like, I wanted vampires that are actually scary, but I also didn't want to deal with the reanimated corpses thing, because that's kind of yucky and also complicated when all your characters are dead. And the demon thing too is one of those things where it's like, okay, if you're actually bringing demons in, like, if I talk about demons in my story, they're going to be like real demons. They're not going to be like mythological takes on demons. And so the way that I described vampires in my story is basically the idea of like a human as twisted as a human could ever become. Like someone who embraced so much evil so intentionally in their life that they are basically as close to a demon as a human could ever get, but they don't like become a demon, because like once you're a human, you're a human. If you become an evil creature who's gained these unnatural powers and fallen as far as somebody could fall, there's still a chance of you moving in a different direction. You know, like even if you've fallen really far, according to Christianity, like if you're not dead yet, you can still change your choices and you can still grow as a person. And I wanted my vampires to be dynamic characters that had the possibility of change, not just like, okay, well, they're bad, that's all. You know, like it's, I wanted it to be kind of a more interesting relationship there and have the possibility of movement in different directions. And so yeah, the vampires of my story could theoretically move towards something better than vampires, but most of them wouldn't, because they're really into the choices that they made. Like, they made those choices intentionally. And so it becomes a very interesting way to explore like what evil can look like in the extreme. Really, how far could a human fall? Like, and of not just bringing in like, oh, the answer is demons, get an exorcist, like we'll fix this problem. Like they are human characters still in a sense, and they have to figure out themselves, and that internal work becomes very important then to the story. It's not just extra added on.
I think that in some ways, The Curse He Chose closes up the theological rifts opened up by stories such as Dracula. In these tales, the evil is made to seem more present and more threatening and more terrifying by essentially disempowering God. They make God and the divine simply just one of a whole arsenal of tools, which also include stakes and garlic. But in The Curse He Chose, God is powerful. Evil is evil. It is still a very real threat. But God is more powerful than that evil, and for those willing to completely trust themselves in Him, victory over evil is possible. Sister Allison opens the story saying, "I've met plenty of people who breathe without living, and only a few of them were what we'd usually refer to as vampires. Most of them don't realize they're not doing either thing, being dead or alive." From the very beginning of this story, Sister Allison is making an effort to close the gap between the monster and the human, to show us just how many of us might be closer to being vampires than we think. But this story isn't a threat. It's not a call to fear death or to fear sin. Rather, it's a call to live, to forgive and to be forgiven, to never forget the past, but to move forward, to not forget our scars, but to seek true healing. By staging the story within the grounds of real Catholic theology, Sister Allison shows that there is real drama, real fear, and real beauty to be found in true belief, even in our contemporary world. But in my opinion, no story addresses the danger inherent in belief better than Mike Flanagan's 2021 Midnight Mass. This one-season TV series is about the tiny fishing island of Crockett, an insular community built largely around their small Catholic church. And from the start, Crockett is a town in decline. Most of the local fish population has been killed by an oil spill, so there isn't any money being brought in, and people are beginning to leave. The town is being slowly deserted, their faith is dying in their community, and their priest has become old and senile. As one final gift to their Monsignor, they send him off on a trip to the Holy Land. But on the day that he's supposed to return, he doesn't show up. Rather, a young priest does, explaining that he's going to take over for the time being because their old Monsignor is back on the mainland recovering from an illness. And the island is filled with a very colorful cast of characters. There's the mayor and his wife and their daughter Lisa, who was accidentally shot and paralyzed by the local drunk Joe. There is a Muslim sheriff and his son trying to escape the chaos and discrimination of the mainland. There's Beverly, a woman who lives more by the word of the gospel than the spirit, running the church from behind the scenes with a zealous pride. There is Erin, a young woman who recently returned to the island after falling pregnant and escaping an abusive relationship. But if there was one protagonist character, I would say that that's Riley. Riley grew up on the island, and he was raised Catholic. He was even an altar boy. But a couple years back, he left the island to pursue his fortune. While he was out in the world, though, he succumbed to addiction, his life spiraled out of control, and he ended up killing a young woman in a drunk driving accident. After spending a couple of years in prison, Riley has been released, and he's returning home a reformed man, but no longer religious. After the terrible wake-up call that was his accident, he finds his presumptions about God shaken completely, and he sets out to find the truth, reading the Bible and every other holy book available to him, and he emerges from this search for truth agnostic, unwilling to accept a God that will allow the kind of evils that he has seen to persist. The heart of this show is the Alcoholics Anonymous meetings that Riley is mandated to attend with the new priest, Father Paul, where they sit down and discuss not necessarily addiction, but faith, particularly Riley's loss of faith. When prodded, he admits that part of the issue is that he doesn't want to believe in an omnipotent, omniscient God that would allow such terrible things to happen. But it goes beyond just the problem of evil. His problem isn't just that a good God would allow bad things to happen, but also the way that the followers of this God use his name to excuse their complacency.
The worst part is that it lets all the rest of us off the hook. We can all just stand by and watch Lisa Scarborough wheel herself around town. We can watch Joe Collie slowly drink himself to death. We can watch so many people just slip into these bottomless pits of awful, and we can stand it. We can tolerate it because we can say things like, God works in mysterious ways. And the only thing that lets people stand by watching all this suffering, doing nothing, is the idea that suffering can be a gift from God. What a monstrous idea, Father.
Riley is getting at something very profound here. The way that religion can be used as a scapegoat, the way that it can foster fanaticism, the way that people can use it to justify inaction. And unfortunately, Riley's claim here is very prophetic for the rest of the show. As Father Paul rallies the faith community, invigorating them with electrified homilies, miracles seem to begin taking place on Crockett. Lisa Scarborough finds herself able to walk again after weeks of daily mass. People begin regaining failing eyesight. Old back wounds and bad knees are healed. And at the heart of all of this is Father Paul, who it turns out is not exactly who he said he was. It's revealed that he is actually the old Monsignor, who went on his trip to the Holy Land but became disoriented while on a tour and was lost in the desert. He stumbled into an ancient cave where he was confronted by a terrible creature with huge wings and glowing eyes. And as this creature attacks him, ripping into his throat and drinking his blood, he thinks,
"Those eyes and skin and hands, but also wings, a sense of great wings enfolding him. And his mind finally found the word. The word was unearthed by his fear, like the tomb was unearthed by the storm, and the word was angel."
Father Paul suffers from a terrible case of blind faith. He spent so long contextualizing everything through the lens of holiness that when he is attacked by an actual monster, he can only assume that it's a blessing. After all, this thing has given him his youth back. It's allowed him the chance to return to his parish, reinvigorated, to re-enlighten his faith community, to show them this miracle, and perhaps to lead the life that he'd always wanted to lead. He decides to take this miracle, the angel, back with him to Crockett, so that he might become a truly revolutionary faith hero, the hero that he always thought that he was, God's chosen one. He begins tainting the communion wine with the blood of the angel, slowly healing his unknowing parishioners with its monstrous magic. Even as he feels his mortal self dying, even as the sun burns his skin when he steps outside, even when he murders Joe Collie to drink his blood, a lifetime of fervent blind faith keeps Father Paul from ever considering that he could have been wrong. Just like Riley said, he can accept the bad things because it's part of God's plan. This is only further propelled by Beverly, who finds out about Father Paul's transformation and his scheme and hastens to lead the charge, thrilled at the prospect of being God's chosen one, of being special like she always knew she was. In fact, all of the people on Crockett are blinded by their desire to be the chosen ones, to be the kind of people that miracles happen to. There are signs that not all is well. Hundreds of cats are found washed up on the shore, completely drained of blood. One by one, people begin to go missing from the outskirts of town, and Erin Green goes to get an ultrasound of her baby, and finds that there is no baby there. The vampire blood that she has unknowingly been consuming identified the baby as a danger to her body, and it made it so that it had never happened. But no one notices these things, or if they do notice, they don't care, because they are too caught up in their fanaticism. This religious revival also heightens pre-existing tensions within the community, small cracks in the structure of their society turning into great rifts under the pressure of being God's chosen ones. The non-Catholics on the island are ostracized and pushed to conform if they ever wish to join in the church community. Beverly takes this opportunity to begin openly preaching the Bible at their public school. She has the explanation that, well, miracles are happening on the island. If ever there was a time to be handing out Bibles to children, then is the time. The sheriff experiences a new onslaught of racism and xenophobia, spearheaded by the supposedly faithful members of the community. The vampire blood is certainly improving these people's bodies, but their spirits are atrophying, their capacity for critical thinking completely overwhelmed by this religious revival, by this blind faith. In one of the most impactful scenes of the show, Riley is accidentally turned into a vampire, and so he and Father Paul sit down for one more meeting. This one will supposedly be completely honest. Father Paul's thought process is completely laid out in this conversation. He insists that they are all a part of God's plan, and that death is not to be a part of this new plan, other than the death that they will experience when they become vampires. He insists that Riley's completely accidental dumb luck turning is actually a sign from heaven that he was specially chosen to be the second or third, technically, vampire on the island. He tries desperately to convince Riley, and perhaps himself, that because it was part of God's plan, his murder of Joe Colley was forgivable, and it's fine that he doesn't feel any guilt. And he tries to tell Riley that if he too accepted God as a scapegoat, he would no longer have to feel the guilt that he feels.
The guilt you feel, the remorse.
Yeah.
You feel that every day.
Yes.
Even though you didn't mean to do it.
Yes.
See, I killed Joe. I watched myself do it with my own hands, and I have no guilt. None. No remorse. I have been spared all of that. How does that make you feel?
Disgusted.
He pushes and pushes and pushes that question until Riley admits that yes, he is jealous. He is jealous that Father Paul could be so delusional as to think that he really is not guilty for the death of Joe Colley, that he really was justified in killing a person because of God. He knows that it would be easier to accept the scapegoat, to accept that it's all that simple, but he also knows better than that, even as he has to sit there and listen to Father Paul finish his homilizing. Riley then goes to kill himself in the morning sun, preferring to die warning Aaron and his family of the coming danger than to become the monstrousness he so detested. But Father Paul will not be stopped. At the Easter Vigil Mass, he reveals his true identity and his true cause to his parishioners, and it results in a horrific bloodbath wherein most of them are turned into vampires. As Father Paul's confidence begins to falter, Beverly takes the charge, making plans for the next night for them to take to boats and sail to the mainland and begin the Great Conversion. These newly made vampires hunt down all of the non-believers, all of the non-vampires on the island, draining them dry in the name of their new gospel. Faith has finally tipped over into overt fanaticism, a fanaticism that will not accept any of the people who go against it. As this fervor swallows the island whole, Father Paul finally realizes the error of his ways, but it's far too late. Some of the other parishioners also finally open their eyes, and with the help of a few non-vampiric survivors, they burn every structure on the island to the ground, so that when the sun rises, they'll all burn together. Beverly is the only one who cannot accept her coming demise. The original vampire flies off, heavily damaged, and its death is never confirmed. The only two survivors are Lisa and Warren, the previously paralyzed girl, and Riley's little brother. Two unblemished people, a girl and a boy, rowing away on their little Noah's Ark to safety. Both of them, although they were attending Mass and taking communion, were untouched by the fanaticism that ripped through the rest of the island, and therefore they are saved, like an Adam and Eve of the new future. The show finally ends with Lisa realizing that she has lost feeling in both of her legs, which I interpret as a restoration of the right way of things. It's painful, it's hard, but it is real. That is what the real world is like. The real enemy in Midnight Mass is not religion, it's not the priest, it's not even the vampire. As Mike Flanagan explains, the angel very much represents a mirror for us. I love that he doesn't seem to have any complex plan or any real personality. It's just a thing that does what it does. When it comes to fundamentalism and fanaticism, it isn't something that necessarily comes to us with a well-thought-out plan or ideology. What it does is it parrots back to us our worst ideas in some cases. It uses our own voice. Fundamentalism, fanaticism, and radical thinking are things that prey on our very worst impulses and our greatest fears. They take us at our weakest. They appeal to our basest and most shameful desires. They tell us that our hatred, our fear, our contempt is just, that as long as it's directed at the right people, as long as it's directed at the other, it is just, it is good. It tells us not to think, but rather to believe, to trust completely and wholeheartedly, and to never, never consider that the hatred that we are spewing at another human being could ever be thought of as wrong. And I do think it's worth remembering that fanaticism is not an inherent part of faith. Being religious does not automatically make you a bad person, just as being religious does not mean that you are a good person. This is made very clear in the show. There are villains in the story, I would say, and there are heroes, but those lines are not drawn along religious boundaries. Take, for example, the characters of Aaron and Riley. They have very similar arcs. Both of them are these sort of prodigal son characters. People that grew up on the island in the faith, went out into the world and made mistakes, and then came back home begging to be forgiven. They have very important, very impactful, very moving arcs, and yet Aaron is a practicing Catholic and Riley is not. Even after the chaos and madness and fanaticism of the Midnight Mass, many of the Catholics on the island that have been turned into vampires amend their ways, and they do not seek to continue down this path of radical thought. Midnight Mass is a scathing condemnation not of religion, but of blind faith, of the monstrous scapegoating that allows us to ignore real injustice, real pain, real suffering, because we can write it off as God's great plan, because at least we are on the right side of things, because at least we are God's chosen ones. I would say that the world that we live in today is more secular than it ever has been in history, but that doesn't mean that we can forget about religion. It is encoded into our DNA, the way that we think, the way we dream, the way that we fear. Sure, a crucifix might not seem like the defense against monstrousness that it was once thought of as, but that doesn't mean we can forget to defend ourselves entirely. That doesn't make these monsters any less real. After all, even in a story like Midnight Mass, the monster doesn't die. Not that we see, because it's never quite that simple. So many vampire stories end with the monster either being killed or redeemed. And those are fun stories, but I think that the real rub lies in those vampire stories, where it's not quite so cut and dry. The unanswered questions of Dracula, the humdrum of evil of Salem's Lot, the agonizing cyclical drama of the Vampire Chronicles. As Mike Flanagan puts it, that last moment of Midnight Mass, of the next generation, of two kids looking out at the ashes of what the grown-ups made. I feel like that's what my kids are gonna get, no matter what. That's what all of our kids are gonna get. I wish it wasn't so on fire, as it is right now, but it really is, and we're never gonna be able to explain that to them. We're never gonna be able to explain adequately to our children what happened to the planet that they inherited, and why their parents' generation treated each other the way that it did. We're never gonna have words to articulate that, and this, for me, is my best guess. It's my best answer for them, in a series of questions that I don't know they'll ever really be able to answer. Fiction is not going to be able to give us the answers we're looking for. At risk of sounding too postmodern, I would say that life doesn't really have neatly packaged answers. Things like religion, philosophy, fiction, learning might get us a little bit closer. But what I think is really important, that just like vampire stories encourage us to do, we keep asking questions. We can't allow ourselves to rot away in the stagnancy of certainty. We can't shove our heads into the sand and act like we can't see the atrocities happening around us. The monsters will still be there. The more we seek the light and the closer we get to it, the less that we can ignore the monster. Walking side by side together, the light and the dark, two sides of the same coin. Religion and the vampire have always been linked, and will always be linked, because they represent the extremes of the human condition. Light and dark, damnation and righteousness, good and evil. And I would say that this space between heaven and hell, the gray area, the differences, and the staggering similarities that we find between the two, the uncomfortable, itchy, sticky questions that it forces us to wrestle with, I would say that those are just as important. I want everybody in the comments to give a huge thank you to my dear sister Allison for helping me out with this video. If you are curious to check out The Curse He Chose, I will be linking the Pauline store where they sell it there. It is also available on Amazon, but I don't like Amazon, so there's that. And I will also link my sister's social media. Also big news, she just announced book 2, which is coming out in January, and I'll bleep that out if I'm not allowed to say when it's coming out yet. This is the cover for it. It's called The Light They Left, and I am so excited for it to come out. So if you want updates on that, I have linked her social media in the description. I know that I am most certainly biased because she is literally my sister, but I highly recommend that you check out The Curse He Chose and the other books that my sister's written, because I think that she's a really good writer. And I'm not just saying that because she's my sister, and no matter your religion or your age, even though these books are technically YA, I highly recommend that you check them out. Do let me know what your favorite vampire story that confronts religion is in the comments. There are so many out there, and there are so many more that I didn't get to talk about in this video, so let me know what your favorite is. As always, all of my sources and works cited are linked in the description if you want to do any further reading on the things that I talked about. And thank you for sitting with me through this video where it was so long that my lights have started dying. That's always a good sign of a very long video. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, be sure to subscribe if you want to tune in for more videos, and send this video to your most vampiric friend. And hopefully they'll see that as a compliment and not an insult, even though I've just spent this whole video talking about how damned and evil vampires are. Thank you so much for joining me here this week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.